Professor McBride 個 slide 已經喺度啦。So let me just briefly introduce. I have done that already. Professor McBride is now professor in the psychology department of Chinese University of Hong Kong. She graduated with a PhD in the Southern California University in developmental psychology. In the field of developmental psychology, she has published more than 100 publications, and also she is the editors and contributors of some specialized books on this topic. Now, today's lecture is not only the joint lecture organized by the Hong Kong Brain Foundation and Hong Kong Science Museum, but it is also a special 30th anniversary lectures of the Chinese University of Hong Kong Psychology Department. So without further ado, I would like to invite Professor McBride.
Thank you very much. I am also here with Ms. Amy Chen, who's here. And so if you have any questions in Chinese, she will help. She has a master's degree in social sciences and a lot of experience working with learning disabled children. So thank you for coming today, and I guess I'll just get started now. I'm going to talk, more than the last lecture, I'm going to talk about research. And I guess if you were to look me up in Google, what you would find is mostly that I tend to do research across cultures. So I work with people on Hebrew or Spanish or Korean, Dutch, because I'm really interested in cross-cultural aspects of reading, and in particular here, dyslexia. I've spent some time trying to learn some Chinese, and I'm not very good at it, but I understand struggling in reading from that perspective. So I guess I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes or so, and then I'll ask if you have any questions. But if you have any questions as I'm going along, feel free to stop me. I know that you may have questions that may be different from what I'm focusing on, so just let me know. So what do we know about dyslexia? I'm just going to show you a few myths, first of all. I see this on TV all the time still, that people talk about the main symptom of dyslexia is reversing letters. Now, it is true that, it's actually true also in Chinese. We've seen people reverse characters in two-character words in Chinese, and also it's very common to reverse letters, but it's not the hallmark of dyslexia. It's basically of interest particularly because if you have no experience in an orthography, you tend to make those kinds of mistakes. It's not that we see letters backwards. Okay, so that is a myth. Is it an eye or visual problem? Mostly not. People keep doing research on different aspects of dyslexia, and there may be something visual that might help some people, but it is not primarily a visual problem. And I'll talk more about that later. Something about intelligence? Absolutely not. The definition of dyslexia is that one's intelligence is of at least normal range, and often people with dyslexia have very high IQs. And does it only affect reading and writing abilities? Probably if you're here, you know enough about dyslexia to know that it's mostly about literacy-related skills. No, it's not only about reading and writing. As we all know also from the last lecture, learning disabilities result in many socio-emotional difficulties and struggles. And so, although it starts there at the cognitive level, it really expands to a lot of aspects of dyslexic children's lives. So that's what I want to say and why I want to say that. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some basics of dyslexia. It's defined as a specific learning disability involving persistent difficulties in reading, writing, and spelling, or dictation. It's strange to talk about spelling in Chinese, but we think about them as equivalent across English and Chinese, despite having adequate opportunities to learn. So you might, the reason we add that last part is it might be the case that you know a child who has particular visual impairment or hearing impairment or has a low IQ or has received no teaching in literacy. If any of those are the case, the reading problems of that child would not be defined as dyslexia. So we need to make sure they have had adequate opportunities to learn. And they don't have any sensory deficits. Eyes and ears are okay. Across languages, every language that has been looked at, dyslexia may be indicated by these things. But as I get further into this talk, I'm going to highlight how Chinese probably expands from this list a bit, because Chinese involves more skills than most alphabetic orthographies, and alphabetic languages have been studied a lot more than Chinese has. So early language disorders, so if you're very slow to speak, your chances of having dyslexia later are increased a lot. So late talkers tend to have a higher risk of dyslexia. Less sensitivity to phonological information, and I'll talk about what that is later, but it's basically speech sounds, not as good at being able to manipulate speech sounds. Sometimes those with dyslexia tend to be really slow. I mean, when you watch them read or spell, it's very clear that, I mean, this is like a hallmark of any child with dyslexia, that they are slow in this. But there are other related skills that they may be slow in as well. Some overlap with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. That's what ADHD stands for. So a lot of those with dyslexia do have attention difficulties of one sort or another. And there is good evidence. We just finished some studies about 2 or 3 years ago in Hong Kong that there's a strong genetic overlap. So if your parent has dyslexia, you're much more likely to have dyslexia than if there's no history of this in the family, for siblings as well. So here are some signs of dyslexia. First, reading difficulties, and also difficulties in remembering print patterns. So sometimes when we see somebody who has dyslexia spelling, they might write the same word 3 or 4 times in the same essay, like the word in English, enough, E-N-O-U-G-H, but children with dyslexia often would write E-N-U-F, E-N-O-U-F, E-N-F, forgetting, how it's very difficult to remember the pattern consistently. And actually, across orthographies, being consistent and understanding the rules of the way things are spelled or written is very, very important for distinguishing those with dyslexia. In addition, there are difficulties in mastering common rules of print. So in English especially, this is one of the most consistent things that we know about, that those with dyslexia have trouble remembering that B sounds like B. So if I were to ask you to spell something that you've never heard before, that's not a real word in English, like Bef, I would spell it B-E-F. You could think about maybe other ways to spell it. But probably most people in this room would guess that it would be spelled with a B. The B would be the first letter. And children with extreme dyslexia, this is an extreme example, but have trouble remembering this as an ordering. In Chinese, there's more of an issue of some of the structural aspects of Chinese characters, like some characters may be structured up, down, or left, right, and knowing that there are these different ways of structuring characters can be very helpful in helping us to learn new characters. And dyslexic children have particular difficulties with these structures. As I said before, across languages, those with dyslexia read very slowly, often are frustrated, and also appear to be quite tired after trying to read. Sometimes they seem to read strangely, like in English, they might stop in the middle of a word and make it sound like that's the end, and then start again from the middle to the end. There are writing and spelling difficulties. I said this before. It's true that dyslexics do reverse letters sometimes or mix them up. And in Chinese, we see this as well, mixing up characters. And so this is also an indication after a while that somebody might be dyslexic. And again, it's probably because dyslexics don't read very much. They don't spend a lot of time writing. It's so frustrating, makes them so unhappy that they would do anything to get out of doing that. So over time, the experience that they have with reading and writing is pretty minimal. It's not as much as most other people, say in the same grade level, who do a lot more reading and writing because they can, because it's easy. Okay, so I think this is a good example of, just getting things out of order because we forget all the patterns of print in our language. Here are some examples of those who write, who have dyslexia. These are actually from Hong Kong, Chinese children. We have a data set in Hong Kong. We've been following some children for 12 years now, and we've followed them for long enough that we know who turned out to be dyslexic. And so you can see some difficulties in writing, some wrong usage of characters, and in English, some trying to write the same words again in different ways because they're trying to sound out what they hear rather than being very consistent in remembering, in recalling how to write certain words. The other thing about dyslexia that I mentioned before is that there are socio-emotional problems related to it. Even with a lot of practice, there's a great deal of frustration that comes with reading and writing, and this is across cultures. And so this just seems to make it worse. I mean, with every grade, and Hong Kong is probably one of the toughest places in the world because formal literacy training begins so early in kindergarten. By the time the child's in first grade, they may be a failure where they might not have been in, say, Sweden or some place where they only begin teaching reading much later. So with every year, frustration becomes worse. And for this reason, I'm going to say this again at the end, but one of the most important things we can do to try to deal with dyslexia is to try to identify those who are at risk for reading problems very early and do some interventions like playing games with them before it becomes a big problem. In the United States, where I'm from, about 10 years ago, they would say, well, don't wait, you should wait to diagnose dyslexics. You can't diagnose someone as dyslexic until they're at least in second or third grade. But by that time, it's very, very late already. The children have had years of failure, and so they're so frustrated by that point that it's difficult to turn it around. It's difficult to get them back into reading. So earlier is better. What causes dyslexia? This is a question we would all like the answer to. I'm only going to tell you a couple of things that are correlated with dyslexia biologically. A main aspect of brain activity that's been identified across different languages is that the left temporal cortex tends to be less active in dyslexics as compared to non-dyslexics. The left temporal region tends to be associated with a lot of language-related functions. In particular, let's see. I want to talk about the planum temporale, which has been, it's within that region, but it's a smaller region, and it tends to be very, it's not very even across the two hemispheres of the brain in those who don't have dyslexia. in those who do have dyslexia, the size of the planum temporale is about the same. In those who do not have dyslexia, the left hemisphere planum temporale is much larger. So again, it's hard to say that this causes dyslexia, but it's a pattern that's been recognized for many languages. And so it seems to suggest that dyslexics do not make use of this language-related region as well as non-dyslexics do. There's also some evidence from local studies. Professor Tan Lee Hai in Hong Kong University is one of them, that another region is maybe kind of unique to Chinese, and this is the middle frontal gyrus, that is responsible for coordinating cognitive skills, including memory. But there haven't been that many studies done on children with dyslexia in any language. So this is preliminary. And also, again, it's correlational. We're not saying one thing causes the other. We don't really know which comes first yet. In addition, there's strong genetics evidence for dyslexia. As I said, a child's risk for dyslexia is between 30 to 50%. If he or she has either a parent or a brother or sister who has dyslexia. And this is true, very clearly true in Hong Kong. There are more and more studies being done in Chinese societies that show it's very similar to what's been shown for English and other alphabetic languages. Now I want to talk about behavioral evidence. And this is more like my own research area, which is how can we figure out who might be at risk for dyslexia, or what are the cognitive skills that are related to dyslexia, and kind of going further than that, if you have dyslexia or if you're at risk for a reading problem, how can we work on these skills to promote them and build them up so that your reading difficulties are diminished? So there are three areas that have been targeted in particular. One is phonological awareness, and I mentioned that initially. This tends to be particularly associated with dyslexia in alphabetic languages. It's also true in Chinese, but you can see it better when the children are very young. As they get older, it's more difficult to see this. But phonological awareness is awareness of and access to speech sounds. And I'll try to give you some examples in a minute. Morphological awareness is awareness of and access to morphemes in language. Morphemes are the smallest units of meaning in language. And in Chinese, what a morpheme is most of the time very simple. One character is one morpheme, or one syllable in Chinese is one morpheme. In English, it's a little more complicated because, like, if you take the word cats, there are two morphemes there. One is cat, the animal. The other is just making it plural with a single letter. But Chinese is more clear in this aspect. And finally, orthographic awareness, which is understanding of or awareness of how print is written. So if you think about language, it kind of builds on these three aspects. Try to imagine listening to a foreign language, maybe Hindi. Maybe most of you in this room don't know Hindi, which is a very common language in India. You don't understand when people are speaking Hindi, but you can probably distinguish most of the speech sounds you hear, even though you don't understand. That's kind of the phonological level. You can distinguish, different sounds. But on top of that, we map morphology, the morphemes, meaning. And that's what we do as we learn a foreign language. We learn, these sounds have this meaning. At the top level is, for reading, is how do you map this meaning onto what is being written and what is being read. So early language difficulties, as I said before, like being a late talker, are associated with subsequent dyslexia. And dyslexics are often relatively slow to learn all kinds of language and print-related tasks. Coming back to cognitive problems of dyslexia, these are the things that have been used to diagnose dyslexia most often. One is letter name knowledge, and that might seem very related to English or other alphabetic orthographies. It might seem that it isn't related to you, to Chinese at all, and that's exactly what I thought. But somehow in Hong Kong, this is also a good indicator of dyslexia, probably because, English letters are taught at the same time as Chinese from kindergarten. So children who don't know many letters of English tend to still be at risk for dyslexia, at least in Hong Kong. Also, rapid naming. If you've been to our exhibit here in the museum, one of our games is rapid naming, just getting you to name some symbols as quickly as you can. Those who are slow in this, that tends to be actually probably the best marker of dyslexia across languages. You might be surprised to know that, for example, even German versus English, the indicators of those who are dyslexic by about second or third grade are different. But even in Chinese, in German, in English, in every language, rapid speeded naming of numbers tends to be the best, but could be other things, is probably the best marker of this. Phonological awareness and morphological awareness. Okay, so this is how we would test letter name knowledge. We would just ask children to name each letter one at a time. This is a speeded object naming test. We created it because each of the objects should be the same 2 syllables in both English and Chinese. So we would just ask children to say what each thing is as quickly as they could and time them. And if they're very slow, again, this is a strong indicator of dyslexia. So just go apple, pencil, lemon, monkey, rainbow, monkey, and just keep going like that and see how fast they are. But in general, when we want to help children with dyslexia to get better, we usually want to target these 3 things, and they're the ones I mentioned before. Speech sounds at the bottom, that's phonological awareness. Meaning in the middle, that's morphological awareness. And how print is written consistently, the rules of print, reading and writing, that's orthographic awareness. Phonological awareness is defined here again, but basically the ability to manipulate speech sounds. And in English, you might say T without the T sound. Or in Chinese, say da without the first sound. If children can take away sounds or put them together orally, not in print, but just saying them, that is a good sign. If they have a lot of difficulty, that's an indicator of risk for dyslexia. These are some more examples if you're interested. Morphological awareness, again, is awareness of the meaning structure of language. As I said, in Chinese, one morpheme is most of the time one character. In English, not so simple. But the ability to put morphemes together is important in all languages. So an example of this, an example of how to test this, we had to get a little bit creative, because if we're just asking children to put together morphemes that they know in words they know, that's vocabulary knowledge. That's a different thing. How many words do you know? But to test morphological awareness, we need to ask children to manipulate morphemes in a sensible way. One example might be, what would you call a dress for a fish? What would you call it? I hear some people saying a fish dress, and that's correct. But a dress fish would be wrong. And so we have other ways of asking this, maybe more complicated. I'm very sorry for my Putonghua, but something like, Changjing Lu. Okay, but what would you call this animal if it had a short neck instead of a long one? So you can think about that. So what we're trying to do is, so I guess it would be Duanjin Lu, something like that. But what we want children and adults to be able to do is to show that they know how to put morphemes together sensibly. So the ordering is very important, or leaving them out. Those are bad signs. Misordering or leaving out morphemes is a problem. Another aspect of morphemes is, especially in Chinese, this is much stronger in Chinese than in English and most other orthographies, being able to distinguish homophones or homographs. Homophones are those that are written differently but sound the same. Homographs are those that are, well, it's easier to explain in English. They're written the same, but they have different meanings. Like in English, riverbank and bank that you get money from, those banks are spelled the same, but they have different meanings. Here are a couple of examples in Chinese, and we're going back and forth between Cantonese and Mandarin, but shu bao or shu fu, the shu in both sounds the same, but it's written differently. So if children know this, it's better. Often dyslexic children do not know this and have trouble with this, and this is something we have to target. Here's another example in English, but I'm going to go on. Orthographic awareness is understanding patterns of print in words. So for example, in Chinese, knowing the radical, say for mouth, is in different words involving the mouth, like eat or kiss or sing. That's important. And there also the structuring of characters is very important. The fact that semantic radicals, the ones that have something to do with meaning, like this sea creature one, should be on one side, and the sound-related radicals should be on another. And you have to be able to keep those straight most of the time. If you can do that, that's good. Dyslexics tend to have trouble with this kind of thing. In English, there are certain rules as well. For example, you cannot begin a word with two S's. That just is not legal in English. And dyslexic children tend to be much less aware of these rules. And I guess if I had to summarize everything about dyslexia across all orthographies, I would say dyslexic children have much more difficulty figuring out the rules. Whatever the rules are, and they're very different in Chinese and English, dyslexic children really can't figure out the rules, and they can't remember the rules. And so that's very important for thinking about remediation. It's also true that dyslexics tend to be slow in processing, especially processing speech. That also has implications for remediation. So those who are dyslexic, you might want to go over the same passage with them and ask them to get faster. For young children, they like to race themselves. So if they took 10 seconds one time, and then they can take 9 seconds the next, that's good for both them because it's kind of fun, and for you because it's getting them to be more automatized. It's getting them to regularize these things. So I think I've been talking all along a little bit about Chinese versus English. I hope I've highlighted already that English tends to focus more on phonological rules than Chinese does. And this is a function of the orthography. English, as you all know, is much simpler than Chinese in that it just has a small group of letters, 26 letters, and they have certain rules that are associated with them. And so being able to sound out and remember what they sound like P usually sounds like P. Not always. There are words like psychology where it doesn't, but most of the time. That's really important and useful. But for Chinese, the sound-related indicators are very minimal compared to any alphabet. And so for that reason, although phonological skills, speech sound skills, are important for Chinese, and we see them in very young children, they're not as important in older children because they're just simply very unreliable in Chinese. So when we look at Chinese dyslexics, we often see some, just like in any other orthography, difficulties in reading and writing, and slowness in reading and writing. But the skills, the cognitive skills that we like to test and promote and think about in helping dyslexics in Chinese may be different and maybe more than in, say, English. Okay. There are remediation implications for this. One is that in Chinese, it's really important to build up morphological skills. So if you can identify one morpheme and know how it looks, for example, in Chinese, in Putonghua, che, huo che, che appears in many words. Another word it appears in would be chuju che, something like that. But as long as you can identify it in different words, it's helpful because it's consistent. And you can say, oh, that's a character I've seen before. That appears in all these different words. And if you get that consistency, it's useful. And it's also true in English. For English, it's more true for root words like psycho. So like psycho, psychology, psychophysics, etc. Here, I want to talk about multiple deficits and the fact that Chinese children may suffer from more difficulties than English-speaking children in dyslexia. There are probably more skills we need to identify early. I think I'm going to skip over this because a lot of it is similar to what I've said before. But this is really trying to compare Chinese and English and show that there really are big differences. For example, in orthographic knowledge and what you have to remember and be aware of in Chinese as compared to alphabets. Let me get to the next question, which is very, very important. Is dyslexia curable? The short answer is no, it's not curable, but those with dyslexia, a lot of them adapt very, very well. There's no easy magic way to deal with dyslexia. When you look at people who've successfully, gone to college or done something very impressive in their careers or whatever, who have dyslexia, you see people who've worked hard and who've tried to understand their own minds and how they learn best, and they've done very well with that. It's not curable. A lot of people ask me questions like, especially in English, there are many videos that teach phonics or audio tapes, phonics, or computer games. Which is the best one? And all I can ever tell them is there's no brand name that's particularly good, but what those, say, video games do when they teach you that B sounds like buh, is that they make it fun for the child to learn it. They repeat over and over and over again. So the only games that I would recommend are just ones that will engage the child, because what you need in all of dyslexia training is something that will maintain the child's interest so that he or she can repeat. There's no easy, simple way to get out of that. There's no medicine we can take, unfortunately. There's nothing like that. But specific language training is useful. Some games may be useful. In English, there are games like, we call it Pig Latin. We make up things like the word tea. The rule is make the first syllable into something with the A sound at the end. So it would be, take tea would be e-te. Take book, it would be uk-bay, something like that, something silly. There are some games you can also play in Chinese, and I might have Amy talk about this a little bit later, but ones where you take one morpheme from the first word and make a new word out of it. So an example in English might be football, ballpark, parkway, way forward, like that. So each morpheme is repeated. And it's, I think, much easier to do in Chinese, but this is an example in English. What I'm saying is these silly language games that feel like we're just playing or just being silly, they actually promote children's literacy skills. If you do it early, it's a good thing. It's a really good thing for learning. And using a variety of teaching methods is extremely important. But I wouldn't say, one dyslexic is only an auditory learner, one is only a touching, tactile learner. I think everybody learns with multisensory, lots of different senses approaches. And the most important thing for any single dyslexic child is to get a variety of games and of materials to help them learn, and also to monitor that child, what works best for them and what is difficult for them. It doesn't work. So what can you do to help? Dyslexia can't be cured, but there's much that parents and teachers can do. One of the first things is the earlier the diagnosis, the better. And we're working on some tasks for testing children as early as 3 years old, because in Hong Kong, 3 is really the time when we need to be able to see if children are at risk. Otherwise, it'll get to be too late and the frustration level will get to be too high. So early diagnosis is key. If you know a child who seems to be a late talker or has relatives with dyslexia, it would not hurt to get the child tested as early as possible. Also, being familiar with these precursors, it's the same thing, is important. So professional help, there are lots of organizations in Hong Kong that can help with diagnosis. And what's the future of those with dyslexia? Well, I think the last talk by Ms. Kung made clear that there are lots of very successful people with dyslexia. Here are some of them. They tend to think differently in some ways, and they've learned to exploit their abilities and their ways of thinking differently in order to maximize their potential. So some people with dyslexia may learn in different ways. And they may have multiple abilities, which means they also have many different ways to learn. And there are actually research groups around the world that are exploring the idea that being dyslexic may promote creativity in some ways. Now, I don't know if it would be like just specifically dyslexia. It may be that anybody who has a limitation of learning that's kind of different from other people may have to find ways around that limitation, and finding ways around it may get them to think differently, and that's basically one definition of creativity. You can take your ways of thinking differently and do new things with it. Dyslexics often also are recognized as doing very well socially in other areas. So I think this is my last slide. Basically, it's very important to have a lot of societal support for those with dyslexia, including supportive families, supportive teachers, and a community that understands dyslexia. Here I would say, for example, Hong Kong is very clear about what dyslexia is, how to define it, how to deal with it. On the mainland, they're still trying to understand all the parameters, and they're still trying to figure out exactly how to diagnose it. So I think here in Hong Kong, things are very up to speed, going very well. But community support is important. I think in some cultures for a while, those who had extreme literacy problems might have been identified as lazy or slow or just not trying hard enough. And it's very clear that this is a specific and probably the best understood learning difficulty of all of them. It's also important, finally, besides the cognitive component, to remember that children with dyslexia need support in other ways. They need to understand, it's not their fault. It's something that they were born with and they can work with, but it is a difficulty. It is a challenge. How do you do that? So something about self-understanding, acceptance, and self-esteem, and finding what we're good at as well as what we have difficulty with is important for all children, but maybe more so for those with dyslexia. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Professor McBride, for sharing your insights and expertise in dyslexia. 好多謝Professor McBride 同我哋分享佢喺讀寫障礙方面嘅專業知識。Just before I forgot, I would like to present a token of appreciation to you. OK， 以下落嚟我想用大約10至15分鐘時間啦，10分鐘左右時間咧，咁就請 Professor McBride 同埋Miss Amy Chan 答一啲聽眾有嘅問題。OK， 有位聽眾喺後面。
I have been diagnosed recently. I'm 22 and I've just get diagnosed as dyslexia and dyspraxia. And obviously if I've gone through my education, obviously I've got somewhere I know how to get on with my exams and my studies, but I still feel very, very difficult and my results have always been just passed and I use all my time to get on with my study work. And I wonder, because when I look at the websites, all of them seems to focus on children. So I guess if I can get any help somewhere else.
So your question is where you can get help in general as a resource now?
Yeah, I sort of don't know what to do because obviously I get diagnosed really late, so...
That's a really great question. There are 2 studies maybe that have been done in Hong Kong on those who are adults with dyslexia. We know in English there haven't been very many either, but what they tend to show is that it seems you're very successful, you've gotten through all your exams. People who have dyslexia often learn to read and write just more slowly. But if you test them as adults, they'll still show the cognitive underlying difficulties, like in English, problems with phonological awareness. But you might be asking more about support. I mean, I don't know that Hong Kong has that much support for adults with dyslexia, but they tend to be going more in the direction of recognizing more difficulties and challenges of people, physical difficulties, and also learning difficulties. In most colleges in many countries, if you have dyslexia, it's recognized that you just simply need more time to do your assignments. You need more time to finish your exams and that kind of thing. So I can say that for your workplace, I guess I would say if you make employers aware, they should give you extra help. I'm not sure if that always happens. But that's about as much as I know about adults. It's a great question, and it's something that researchers would really like to look a lot more at. We just have only really been diagnosing dyslexia in Hong Kong formally for maybe 20 years or so. So it's not as quick as I think, say, in the West, they've been doing it for 10 or 20 more years. So we just need some more time to recognize that. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
So Amy, do you want to translate it to Cantonese?
剛才嗰位小姐問嘅問題係關於即係而家香港對於即係成人嘅讀寫障礙有啲乜嘢嘅支援啦，但係其實即係教授都話其實香港都未必有好多支援住嘅而家，咁就其實無論喺香港或者係外國一啲研究裏面咧，呢一樣嘢都唔係好 common 嘅啫，即係唔係好普遍嘅啫。咁所以即係我哋教授即係作為一個研究者都會留意多啲。
Hi, I just want to ask, are there any screening programs for dyslexia in the States, and what about Hong Kong? And my second question is, I know in Hong Kong there are some child assessment centers which assess the child's developmental growth. Do they screen for dyslexia in these centers, and do they deal with them?
I'm going to take your second question first, and then I need to ask you a question about your first one again. Sorry. The child assessment centers do screen for dyslexia, and they're very interested and concerned with early diagnosis. So when I was saying, we're working on some studies now to identify children as early as age 3, we're doing that in cooperation with some of the kindergarten teachers, because there are simple screening measures that we can use to find the children who really are quite low in some language-related measures. And so I think they're doing quite a good job of that, and they recognize that it needs to be early. Dr. Catherine Lamb gave a speech, a talk in this series, I think, a few weeks ago, and she is in charge of that aspect of the program. She's very aware of the research and very anxious to do this, especially because, as I said, Hong Kong is a unique society, even among Chinese societies, because of the expectations for literacy mastery so early. Taiwan, the mainland, Singapore, it's all about 5 or 6. Here, really, formal training starts at 3.5, and that's very different. So yes. But the first question, there was one word that you said that I didn't hear. So can you repeat your question one more time? Oh, similar screening programs. The states have very well-established measures for establishing what dyslexia is. They wouldn't start probably till age 4 at the earliest. It's more like age 5. But the tests that are used to look at that are almost all focused on phonological processing, some of the tasks I showed you here today. And yeah, they've been used for the last 20 or 30 years. Hong Kong really has only established our measures firmly in the last 10 or so. Thank you.
好，咁頭先嗰位先生就問，即係而家香港嗰個兒童評估中心有冇會唔會評估到讀寫障礙出嚟啦？咁其實而家都有嘅，嗰個評估中心都有評估到呢個讀寫障礙嘅。咁但係香港嘅評估咧，其實都比較新啦，只要10年啦。但係頭先教授話美國咧就大概已經有20年左右嘅不同種類嘅評估工具已經出咗嚟㗎啦。
Okay, 仲有冇問題? Okay, yeah.
2 questions from me. The first is you mentioned that dyslexia is related to genetics. So how is it carried, like a recessive gene? So for example, if you have a kid with dyslexia and the sibling doesn't have that, does the sibling have a higher chance of passing it on to his or her kids later? That's the first one. And the second one is, for kids with dyslexia, do they usually have a problem learning mathematics? Because mathematics is often seen as a language as well.
Okay, 2 excellent questions. The first, I don't know much about genetics, but it can skip generations. Yes, if you have those who are dyslexic in your family, even if you don't have it, but your sibling does, in the next generation, it's possible your child will have it. And it's more likely, slightly, in boys than in girls. This is clear across all cultures. So being male is also more of a risk factor. For the second question, what was the second question about? Oh, mathematics. Dyscalculia is a condition that more and more people are doing research on, and Hong Kong is doing a lot of that, or has been for the last 5 years. There is a high overlap between dyslexia and dyscalculia, which is what this formal mathematics difficulty is called. I think Hong Kong is working on a test to establish formally whether somebody has that. But yes, the overlap is quite high. It's just that mathematics disorders have been studied much less than dyslexia, so we know less about them. But yes, you're right, it is a high overlap.
頭先剛才嗰位女士就問到即係一個遺傳嘅因素啦。咁教授都話其實即係除咗即係本身父母傳俾仔女之外咧，都會有跨代遺傳嘅。另外就係即係男仔嘅有讀寫障礙都會多過女仔嘅。另外就係即係講緊數學係咪？係啦，數學其實都係有即係我哋都研究到其實都有關係嘅。
但係知得比較少啲而家。仲有冇問題 ？OK。
咁咧我個小朋友嘅咧就佢嗰個情緒咧唔係好穩定嘅，咁佢冇一個即係唔安全，即係佢都唔會傷害別人，又唔會傷害自己嘅。不過佢就會發出聲音，即係例如揼台揼凳，上台就揼台揼凳，咁就佢要舒緩啊，佢要自己舒緩啊。咁而佢呢一樣嘢就令到同學咧、老師咧都好難好難接受啊。咁佢就算唔揼台揼凳，佢都會發出聲話資助或者吹口哨啊咁。佢不至於吹口哨，總之會發出聲音咯，令到自己。咁佢會呢一樣嘢會令到佢自己呢個情緒唔穩定啊。咁呢一個係佢一個問題啦。第二個就係我想問一個我嘅問題，作為一個家長呢，我應該有個心理準備，就係話佢幾時可以認知到自己嗰個問題，而令到佢嘅情緒平復。我喺佢嘅成長嘅階段裏邊，我需要一個心理準備，就係話要大概去幾多歲？而家係中3，要大概幾多歲？即係好似 Ada， 好似頭先有個女士呢，佢係啱啱成年評估咗係啦，咁佢都係好遲，佢啲中1嗰陣時，佢先至評估係嘅。咁我都覺得嗰位女士呢，雖然佢評估係，但係佢係認知咯，對自己。我個小朋友係唔認知咯，即係佢係啦，咁變咗咧，佢就會係即係我係唔知點 deal with佢個情緒啊，佢自己同埋我要俾幾大嘅心理準備自己咧咁樣咯。而家係中3係啦。
This lady, she has a son with 係咪 learning difficulty 定係 dyslexia？Okay, her son has some learning difficulties, which cause some emotional disturbance to her son, which like he will make out some like sounds and rocking the chair. And so, as a parent, she wanted to know how she can like make her son aware that he has like learning difficulties, and how he can be how she can be prepared for this.
How old is he?
15, 14.
Because he's not stable, because he cannot realize his disability and make himself the emotional not stable. And this is the first question. I do not know how long. And my question, the second is myself. I do not know how to prepare how long I can accommodate him for like 5 years. When he grows up, then the emotional of himself will become more stable. Like the lady, I don't think she has the emotional stable. She can good present herself with the difficulties. You know, she realizes, and I do not know how to prepare myself and make myself more stable.
And your son has dyslexia, or he has more than dyslexia? He has several. So. Right. This is a very important but difficult question, especially since he's an adolescent already. Because I would want to know more about like how the teachers are handling it. You know, if he's getting special help every week, support, for his special educational needs. I think one thing that's important is to try to find a lot of resources, hopefully in Hong Kong, other kids who have similar difficulties, because I think students of about the same age who suffer the same kinds of difficulties can really learn from one another. I think sometimes in Hong Kong, it might be the case that there's only, say, one student or two in a given classroom, or even in a given school who have the same difficulties, so that gives one a sense of a lot of isolation. And if this student, if you could somehow find others, maybe through the education department or the health department who would know other kids of about the same age who could share a little bit, that might help. The behavioral problems you're talking about, some of them might require some intervention from a social worker or clinical psychologist. I'm not really sure. But the most important question is, what can you do? I guess you can learn all you can about his difficulties, and also maybe try to help him find what he's good at, what his strengths are, because I think most students have certain strengths or certain interests that we can build on, and that might give them some confidence. Now, I know that's a very simplistic answer, but that's the best I can do for now. Sorry.
教授話咧，即係最好家長如果有讀寫障礙嘅小朋友，都係最好揾多啲支援啦。即係有需要嘅時候，可能真係要揾社工啊，或者臨床心理學家去幫助嘅。咁同埋即係作為家長都可以學多啲關於即係讀寫障礙啊、學習障礙呢一方面嘅嘢咧，令到你了解多啲其實佢喺邊一方面係有困難咯。係啦，咁同埋發掘多啲佢嘅長處咯，盡量係啦。
OK， 我諗今日嘅時間都差唔多，因為我哋都過咗10分鐘啦。咁我喺呢度再次多謝 Professor McBride 同埋 Amy Chan， 亦都多謝大家嘅嚟臨。咁我哋嗰個腦語認知嘅講座應該仲有，如果我冇記錯嘅話，咁大家可以留意下科學館嗰個網站。多謝大家。
I know in Hong Kong there are some child assessment centers which assess the child's developmental growth. Do they screen for dyslexia in these centers, and do they deal with them?
I'm going to take your second question first, and then I need to ask you a question about your first one again. Sorry. The child assessment centers do screen for dyslexia, and they're very interested and concerned with early diagnosis. So when I was saying, we're working on some studies now to identify children as early as age 3, we're doing that in cooperation with some of the kindergarten teachers, because there are simple screening measures that we can use to find the children who really are quite low in some language-related measures. And so I think they're doing quite a good job of that, and they recognize that it needs to be early. Dr. Catherine Lam gave a speech, a talk in this series, I think, a few weeks ago, and she is in charge of that aspect of the program. She's very aware of the research and very anxious to do this, especially because, as I said, Hong Kong is a unique society, even among Chinese societies, because of the expectations for literacy mastery so early. Taiwan, the mainland, Singapore, it's all about 5 or 6. Here, really, formal training starts at 3.5, and that's very different. So yes. But the first question, there was one word that you said that I didn't hear. So can you repeat your question one more time? Oh, similar screening programs. The states have very well-established measures for establishing what dyslexia is. They wouldn't start probably till age 4 at the earliest. It's more like age 5. But the tests that are used to look at that are almost all focused on phonological processing, some of the tasks I showed you here today. And yeah, they've been used for the last 20 or 30 years. Hong Kong really has only established our measures firmly in the last 10 or so. Thank you.
好，咁頭先嗰位先生就問，即係而家香港嗰個兒童評估中心有冇會唔會評估到讀寫障礙出嚟啦？咁其實而家都有嘅，嗰個評估中心都有評估到呢個讀寫障礙嘅。咁但係香港嘅評估咧，其實都比較新啦，只要10年啦。但係頭先教授話美國咧就大概已經有20年左右嘅不同種類嘅評估工具已經出咗嚟㗎啦。
OK，仲有冇問題 ？OK， yeah.
Two questions from me. The first is you mentioned that dyslexia is related to genetics. So how is it carried, like a recessive gene? So for example, if you have a kid with dyslexia and the sibling doesn't have that, does the sibling have a higher chance of passing it on to his or her kids later? That's the first one. And the second one is for kids with dyslexia, do they usually have a problem learning mathematics? Because mathematics is often seen as a language as well.
Okay, two excellent questions. The first, I don't know much about genetics, but it can skip generations. Yes, if you have those who are dyslexic in your family, even if you don't have it, but your sibling does, in the next generation, it's possible your child will have it. And it's more likely, slightly, in boys than in girls. This is clear across all cultures. So being male is also more of a risk factor. For the second question, what was the second question about? Oh, mathematics. Dyscalculia is a condition that more and more people are doing research on, and Hong Kong is doing a lot of that, or has been for the last 5 years. There is a high overlap between dyslexia and dyscalculia, which is what this formal mathematics difficulty is called. I think Hong Kong is working on a test to establish formally whether somebody has that. But yes, the overlap is quite high. It's just that mathematics disorders have been studied much less than dyslexia, so we know less about them. But yes, you're right, it is a high overlap.
頭先剛才嗰位女士就問到即係一個遺傳嘅因素啦，咁教授都話其實即係除咗即係本身父母傳俾仔女之外咧，都會有跨代遺傳嘅。另外就係即係男仔嘅有讀寫障礙都會多過女仔嘅。另外就係即係講緊數學係咪？係啦，數學其實都係有即係我哋都研究到其實都有關係嘅。
但係知得比較少啲而家。仲有冇問題 ？OK。
咁咧我個小朋友嘅咧就佢嗰個情緒咧唔係好穩定嘅，咁佢冇一個即係唔安全，即係佢都唔會傷害別人，又唔會傷害自己嘅。不過佢就會發出聲音，即係例如揼台揼凳，上台就揼台揼凳，咁就佢要舒緩啊，佢要自己舒緩啊。咁而佢呢一樣嘢就令到同學咧、老師咧都好難接受啊。咁佢就算唔揼台揼凳，佢都會發出聲話資助或者吹口哨啊咁。佢不至於吹口哨，總之會發出聲音咯，令到自己。咁佢會呢一樣嘢會令到佢自己呢個情緒唔穩定啊。咁呢一個係佢一個問題啦。第二個就係我想問一個我嘅問題，作為一個家長呢，我應該有個心理準備，就係話佢幾時可以認知到自己嗰個問題，而令到佢嘅情緒平復。我喺佢嘅成長嘅階段裏邊，我需要一個心理準備，就係話要大概去幾多歲？而家去中3，要大概幾多歲？即係好似 Ada， 好似頭先有個女士呢，佢係啱啱成年評估咗係啦，咁佢都係好遲，佢啲中1嗰陣時，佢先至評估係嘅。咁我都覺得嗰位女士呢，雖然佢評估係，但係佢係認知咯，對自己。我個小朋友係唔認知咯，即係佢係啦，咁變咗咧，佢就會係即係我係唔知點 deal with 佢個情緒啊，佢自己同埋我要俾幾大嘅心理準備自己咧咁樣咯。而家係中3係啦。
This lady, she has a son with 係咪 learning difficulty 定係 dyslexia？ Okay. Her son has some learning difficulties, which cause some emotional disturbance to her son, which like he will make out some like sounds and rocking the chair. And so, as a parent, she wanted to know how she can like make her son aware that he has like learning difficulties, and how he can be how she can be prepared for this.
How old is he?
15, 14.
Because he's not stable, cause he cannot realize his disability and make himself the emotional not stable. And this is the first question. I do not know how long. And my question, the second is myself. I do not know how to prepare how long I can accommodate him for like 5 years. When he grows up, then the emotional of himself will become more stable. Like the lady, I don't think she has the emotional stable. She can good present herself with the difficulties. You know, she realizes, and I do not know how to prepare myself and make myself more stable.
And your son has dyslexia, or he has more than dyslexia? He has several. So. Right. This is a very important but difficult question, especially since he's an adolescent already. Because I would want to know more about like how the teachers are handling it. You know, if he's getting special help every week, support for his special educational needs. I think one thing that's important is to try to find a lot of resources, hopefully in Hong Kong, other kids who have similar difficulties, because I think students of about the same age who suffer the same kinds of difficulties can really learn from one another. I think sometimes in Hong Kong, it might be the case that there's only, say, one student or two in a given classroom, or even in a given school who have the same difficulties, so that gives one a sense of a lot of isolation. And if this student, if you could somehow find others, maybe through the education department or the health department who would know other kids of about the same age who could share a little bit, that might help. The behavioral problems you're talking about, some of them might require some intervention from a social worker or clinical psychologist. I'm not really sure. But the most important question is, you know, what can you do? I guess you can learn all you can about his difficulties, and also maybe try to help him find what he's good at, what his strengths are, because I think most students have certain strengths or certain interests that we can build on, and that might give them some confidence. Now, I know that's a very simplistic answer, but that's the best I can do for now. Sorry.
教授話咧，即係最好家長如果有讀寫障礙嘅小朋友，都係最好揾多啲支援啦。即係有需要嘅時候，可能真係要揾社工啊，或者臨床心理學家去幫助嘅。咁同埋即係作為家長都可以學多啲關於即係讀寫障礙啊、學習障礙呢一方面嘅嘢咧，令到你了解多啲其實佢喺邊一方面係有困難咯。係啦，咁同埋發掘多啲佢嘅長處咯，盡量係啦。
OK， 我諗今日嘅時間都差唔多，因為我哋都過咗10分鐘啦。咁我喺呢度再次多謝 Professor McBride 同埋 Amy Chan， 亦都多謝大家嘅嚟臨。咁我哋嗰個腦語認知嘅講座應該仲有，如果我冇記錯嘅話，咁大家可以留意下科學館嗰個網站。多謝大家。